Let's begin not with a fork or knife, but with a sin. Imagine sitting down for a meal, but before you lift a single bite to your mouth, you pause. Not to say grace, not to admire the aroma, but to silently ask yourself, will this food condemn my soul to hell? Welcome to the medieval dinner table. This was a world where eating wasn't just about nourishment, nor was it about joy, celebration, or even survival. To the people of the Middle Ages, eating was a moral act, a battlefield between virtue and vice. Each bite, each swallow, each craving could be loaded with spiritual consequence. Eat too much was a sin. Eat too well was vanity. Eat the wrong food on the wrong day. That could be heresy. In a world where the church was the moral compass, the social authority, and, let's be honest, the nosy neighbor in everyone's pantry, food became something to be feared as much as desired. Not because it might be poisonous, but because it might corrupt the soul. The heart of this moral cuisine was one of Christianity's most enduring fears: the body, that fleshy, sinful vessel that led people into temptation, indulgence, and weakness. And what is eating, after all, if not feeding the body? So, the act itself became suspect. Now, don't mistake this for a religion that hated food. Oh no. Medieval feasting halls still groaned under the weight of roasted boars, jellied fish, and almond milk stews. But the rules governing who could eat what, and when, and how were legion. And the punishments for breaking those rules? Eternal. But before we explore the contradictory carnival of church food calendars, or why monks sometimes ate more than kings, or how nobles got around fasting rules by dining on grilled dolphin, let's ask a simpler question. Why was eating, something so basic, so essential, so universal, treated like such a dangerous, shameful act? The answer lies in the very bones of medieval Christianity. According to church doctrine, sin wasn't just about murder, theft, or blasphemy. It crept into the cracks of ordinary life. There were 7 deadly sins, and right there, nestled between wrath and lust, was gluttony, the excessive indulgence in food and drink. It wasn't just overeating. That was wrong. It was caring too much about the pleasure of food. To crave that extra slice of bread, that second ladle of stew, or that expensive goose pâté was to lose sight of divine grace. Gluttony wasn't about the belly. It was about the soul's priorities, and so the church developed a vast and complicated culinary map: feast days, fast days, vigils, Lents, Ember days, Fridays, Saints' days, Advents, and more. For nearly half the year, Christians were expected to fast in some form. That meant no meat, no animal fats, and often reduced meals altogether. But don't think fasting meant starvation. Oh no, this wasn't about suffering. It was about discipline. It was about mortifying the flesh to elevate the spirit. If the body is a temptation, then food is its seductive partner. So to restrain one's appetite was to strengthen the will and prove one's spiritual mettle. Naturally, this opened up a world of strange moral algebra. Take the simple act of eating meat. In medieval thought, meat, especially red meat, was considered hot and moist. In humoral theory, the medical system of the time, it was thought to stimulate passion and bodily urges. Fish, by contrast, was cold and wet, passive, humble, tamed. So on Fridays and other fasting days, meat was banned. But you could eat fish, which led to some creative classifications. For example, beavers lived in water, had a scaly tail, and could swim. Therefore, obviously, they were fish. So were otters. So were puffins. Yes, puffins. Theologians and monks wrote entire treatises on which animals qualified as fish for Lent. The stakes eternal damnation, and then there was intent. Even eating bread and water could be gluttonous if you wanted it too much. If you savored your humble soup with too much pleasure, you might be sinning. On the flip side, if you dined on 12 dishes of lavish trout and oysters, but did so with the proper pious spirit, you were golden. Of course, this led to contradictions. The rich, as always, found ways to fast sumptuously. The poor, meanwhile, were barely eating to begin with. Yet it was they who were often chastised for eating with greed or urgency, as if starvation itself could be a moral failing. And here lies one of the great hypocrisies of the era. While nobles and clerics engaged in debates about whether eel pie counted as a sin, peasants boiled whatever roots they could scavenge. While monasteries built elaborate fish ponds to supply their fasting menus, the average family couldn't afford a single salted herring. Food was spiritual, but it was also political. It was a mirror of power, privilege, and piety. And in this world, every meal was a ritual, every craving a test, every plate a sermon. The fork had not yet arrived in many regions of Europe, but the church had already. Skewer dinner with the sharp prongs of theology. The next time you sink your teeth into a juicy steak or steal a midnight snack, remember, there was a time when that very act might have sent your soul to hell. In the Middle Ages, you didn't just eat food. You ate with fear, and we've only just begun to taste what that fear looked like. So, what did it actually mean to live under this theology of the table? Let's peer into the daily rhythm of a devout Christian in, say, 12th century France. You wake before dawn. You pray. You labor, whether in field, kitchen, or cathedral. When the bell chimes midday, your stomach grumbles. You sit for your first solid meal, maybe your only meal. And here's the real twist. It's not up to you what you'll eat, that it's up to the church calendar. The liturgical year was a dizzying maze of edible commandments. The church divided time not by seasons or harvests, but by feast days and fast days. And believe it or not, fast days often outnumbered feast days. On average, over 150 days a year were designated as fasting days, days without meat, dairy, or indulgence. Lent alone was 40 days long and included not just Sundays but the weekdays in between. Advent had its own fasts. Ember days came 4 times a year. Saint days brought their own rules. And Fridays? Well, Fridays were always a problem, because Friday was the day Christ died. And so, every Friday became a miniature penance, a reminder that pleasure must be withheld in memory of his suffering. No meat, no fat, often no cheer. The result? People became masters of creative compliance. Fish became the fasting food of the masses, if you could afford it. Wealthy monasteries stocked ponds with perch, carp, and even imported salt cod. In coastal cities, fishmongers thrived on Fridays. And during Lent, and in places where fish was scarce, people stretched theology like dough in a famine. Did you know that barnacle geese were once considered fish? Yes, since no one in Europe had ever seen these geese lay eggs or raise young. They supposedly hatched from barnacles attached to driftwood. They were declared aquatic by birthright. Therefore, edible during Lent. In fact, one 12th century Irish bishop wrote with great confidence that God had clearly intended barnacle geese as a special gift to fasting Christians. It was divine loophole logic, but the deeper irony? Even in their most pious abstinence, the rich ate better than the poor did on their best feast days. Take, for example, the great abbeys and cathedrals of England or France. When fasting, monks might refrain from red meat, but enjoy grilled salmon with saffron, buttered eel, stuffed trout, or fish pies soaked in almond milk and spices from the East. Was it humble? Perhaps. Was it cheap? Not at all. Meanwhile, a peasant, Woman in a rural village might boil turnip greens and barley in water and offer thanks that her children had anything to eat at all. And still, if she dared eat a scrap of meat on a Friday, she risked public scorn, or worse, confession. The gap between rich and poor was not just in gold or land, but in permission to eat. Even among the clergy, fasting often became a performance rather than sacrifice. Some orders, like the Benedictines, followed strict rules: one meal a day during Lent, no meat from quadrupeds, silence at table. But others, like the Cluniacs, interpreted these rules with elegant ambiguity. They simply defined poultry as white meat rather than red meat, and thus not truly forbidden. Ducks, chickens, swans, they all glided onto the Lenten platter in some monasteries. The Friday fish menu was so elaborate, it required its own kitchen staff. Chronicles describe kitchens steaming with saffron-flecked sauces, aromatic fish broths, and fragrant stews, all served under the banner of holy abstinence. The hypocrisy did not go unnoticed by the 13th century. Satirical poets and lay writers began poking fun at the gluttonous monks who fasted on 12 courses of fish pâté. One anonymous French poem jokes that some monks spent more on Lenten menus than nobles did on weddings. Another English writer described a monk who forswore flesh but swallowed the sea. Still, the rules endured. Why? Because food had become a spiritual test, and one whose complexity gave the church authority over nearly every aspect of life. To break the fasting law wasn't merely disobedient, it was disloyal to God's cosmic meal plan. And the penalties weren't only in the afterlife. That a baker caught selling forbidden pastries during Lent could be fined, beaten, or excommunicated. A butcher who dared display lamb chops on Good Friday might face the pillory or have his shop shuttered. In some towns, public food patrols enforced church diet rules like moral customs officers. Imagine, for a moment, a world where what you ate determined whether you were pure or sinful, where hunger and holiness were confused, where even the smell of roast meat on the wrong day might be enough to damn a man's reputation. It's no wonder that so many medieval people approached food with a mix of reverence, suspicion, and shame. But this obsession with dietary purity wasn't just about penance. It was also about ordered. In the medieval imagination, the universe was a hierarchy: heaven above, earth below, beasts below men, women below men, peasants below lords, and so on. Everything had its place, including food. Meat was higher than vegetables, fresh bread higher than rye. White sugar, when it appeared, was essentially holy dust. To consume the higher foods was to imitate the nobility or even divinity, but only if you were allowed to. Otherwise, it was gluttony, pride, rebellion. So food was regulated not just by theology, but by class. The poor could not afford sin. The rich could afford to sanctify it. And thus, in the strange logic of the medieval world, a monk feasting on trout was humble. A peasant gnawing a rabbit thigh on a Friday was corrupt. It's a wonder anyone enjoyed a meal at all. It's Friday in the year 1273. The cathedral bells toll as the sun rises over a small town in northern Italy. In the butcher's quarter, the market stalls are empty. No pork, no beef, no scent of sizzling fat or cracking bones. Just the dull murmur of townspeople huddled around a fishmonger's cart, eyeing slabs of salt cod like it's made of gold, because it might as well be that it's Friday, and that means no meat. Not by personal choice, not because of famine or cost, but because the church said so. Let's start with the obvious. Why was Friday the day of dietary damnation? It was all about the passion of Christ. Friday was the day Jesus died, and so the faithful were expected to mourn, not through tears, but through the stomach. Deny yourself the pleasures of the table to remember the pain of the cross. And what greater pleasure was there in medieval cuisine than meat? Forget Michelin stars. In the Middle Ages, meat was the ultimate symbol of abundance and joy. It was expensive, it was rare, and it was often the first thing sacrificed when it was time to repent. The idea wasn't new. Early Christian writings already described fasting as a form of purification. But by the High Middle Ages, fasting had mutated into a full-blown institution, complete with calendars, exemptions, confessions, and even penance tariffs for breaking the rules. That it's not just that meat was rich. It was also considered morally dangerous. Medieval theologians believed that eating the flesh of warm-blooded animals inflamed the body. It stirred up lust. It awakened sin. It made the body too hot and passionate. The language wasn't just poetic. Medieval medical theory, rooted in Galenic humors, taught that different foods affected your spiritual state. Meat made you vigorous, aggressive, earthy. Fish, on the other hand, was cool, moist, calm. Eating fish helped you remain chaste and humble. It nourished the soul without exciting the flesh. Oh, the church decreed no meat on Fridays, no meat during Lent, and in many cases, no meat on Wednesdays, Advent, or on the eves of saint feast days. That, let's just say, medieval cooks got creative. Here's a short list of Lenten and Friday menu items. Xenotation spot fish pies made with eel, perch, or haddock. Xenotation spot almond milk stews with breadcrumbs, and rosewater. Xenotation spot cheese and butter. If the local rules allowed dairy. Xenotation spot mushroom stuffed with herbs. Xenotation spot pulses, beans, onions, and porridge. Xenotation spot. And in some monasteries, beaver tails. Yes, beavers, because beavers were aquatic. Some theologians argued their tails counted as fish. In fact, Pope Gregory I, or so the legend goes, confirmed that semi-aquatic animals could be eaten on fast days, provided they lived in water. Otters, puffins, even capybaras in South America, though that was centuries later. The logic? If it swims, it's penance. Even barnacle geese, remember, were believed to hatch from driftwood and barnacles, thus seaborne, and therefore acceptable Lenten cuisine. That's not dietary science. That's medieval loopholing at its finest. This obsession with meatless days didn't just shape theology, it reshaped entire economies. Coastal towns boomed. Salt cod became an international commodity. Rivers and fish ponds became battlegrounds for food supply and spiritual discipline. Monasteries raised their own fish, employing entire teams of fishmasters to stock, catch, clean, and cook on schedule. In England, monastic fish ponds dotted the countryside, so many that their layouts can still be seen in aerial photos today. In France, inland markets were flooded with smoked herring and dried lamprey, especially during Lent. And prices? Oh, they surged. During Lent, the cost of fish could triple. Poor townsfolk might be forced to eat only onions and black bread, while the clergy dined on buttered trout and almond sauce, still within the rules, technically, but morally debatable. But this wasn't just about avoiding meat. It was about being seen doing it. Fasting became a public spectacle of holiness. Kings fasted before war campaigns. Clergy fasted before Easter sermons. Nobles fasted as penance for murder, adultery, or just being generally awful, and people bragged. Chroniclers tell us of one noblewoman who fasted for so many days on bread and wine that her skin turned translucent and her breath smelled of roses. Another saint was said to survive for years on nothing but the Eucharist. These were not dietary guidelines. These were stories of sacred anorexia. Even average townspeople were pressured to perform their piety. Failing to fast could lead to gossip, public shaming, or worse, confession, penance, and possibly excommunication. This culture of surveillance around food wasn't a side effect. It was the point that in a society where few could read or write, and sermons were in Latin, eating was a visible, communal act of faith. What you ate mattered. When you ate mattered. And who you were seen eating with. That mattered most of all. That here's the twist no one likes to talk about. Fasting often meant more elaborate meals. That a roast pig was forbidden, but a 5-layer eel. Pie with saffron sauce and raisins was perfectly acceptable. Boiled beef? No. Almond milk stewed pike, served in a silver bowl? Yes, please. Rich people didn't suffer through fasting. They turned it into a luxury event. Just like modern-day detox diets, medieval fasting allowed the privileged to feel righteous and indulgent at the same time. The poor, meanwhile, got drier bread, fewer beans, and a longer Lent. The irony was palpable. And occasionally, so was the backlash. By the late Middle Ages, there were murmurings of protest. Some mystics and heretics began questioning the value of external fasting. Was it really holy to gorge on fancy fish while pretending to be penitent? Wasn't it better to eat simply and love deeply? In the 14th century, thinkers like Meister Eckhart and Jan Hus began de-emphasizing rigid food rules in favor of internal purity. But the church doubled down. More rules, more feast calendars, more punishments. That it wouldn't be until the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century that the whole fasting system started to unravel. Martin Luther himself was not a fan of forced fasts. He mocked the idea that skipping sausages made one closer to God. Protestants in Switzerland even staged a sausage revolt in 1522, where citizens openly ate sausages during Lent in defiance of the bishop, and thus, slowly, the grip of ecclesiastical gastronomy began to loosen. Even today, echoes of these traditions remain. Catholics are still encouraged to abstain from meat on Fridays, especially during Lent. Fish and chip Fridays in England? That's a cultural remnant of religious fasts. And the concept of giving something up for Lent continues worldwide, whether it's chocolate, soda, or social media. But in the Middle Ages, it was so much more than discipline. It was an obsession, a system, a lifestyle. To eat was to sin, to fast was to shine, and to follow the calendar was to earn salvation, one bite, or one absence at a time. But let's return now to the streets of a medieval city. It's Friday. The market is bustling, but with a peculiar, almost eerie rhythm. The butcher shutters his stall early, his cleavers idle. No pigs squeal. No chickens flutter from crates. Instead, carts brimming with freshwater carp creak along cobblestones, leaving behind trails of melting ice and scales. For those wealthy enough, a Friday meal was not one of suffering, but of strategy. An entire branch of medieval cookery evolved to meet the demand for lavish meals that technically followed the rules. And the cookbooks of the time? They tell a hilarious and slightly hypocritical story. Take, for example, the For Me of Curry, a 14th century English cookbook attributed to the court of Richard II. It features meatless dishes crafted with such extravagance they rival the meaty meals they replace that you'll find. Xenotation spot tart of fish, filled with lamprey, dates, and saffron. Xenotation spot grue de pescades, a thick fish stew, seasoned with sugar and exotic spices. Xenotation spot, and perhaps most curiously, fake meat recipes. Dishes sculpted to look like meat, made entirely from fish or legumes. Medieval chefs were artisans of illusion. They didn't just comply with the church's rules, they danced on the edge of them. Think of it like a religious game of technicalities. Can't eat roast duck? No problem. Mold almond paste and eel into the shape of a duck. Still holy, still delicious, and delightfully clever. But don't be fooled. This wasn't just culinary creativity. It was moral performance that to eat with restraint meant to live virtuously. To avoid meat was to avoid sin. But not all sin was equal, and not all fasts were either. Peasants, with no access to exotic fish or almonds, often relied on onions, lentils, or sour porridge. Their abstinence wasn't elegant, it was brutal. And here lies the heart of the medieval paradox. The rich fasted in decadence, while the poor fasted in desperation. The bishop might dine on spiced trout, saffron pottage, and imported figs, all within the rules. Meanwhile, a farmer gnawed stale bread, sipping cabbage water by the hearth. Yet somehow, both were counted as faithful participants in the same ritual of renunciation. That it wasn't just about what you ate. It was about how gracefully you suffered. Of course, the church wasn't taking chances. In many parts of Europe, civil law mirrored religious law when it came to fasting. In 13th century England, eating meat on a fast day could lead to public penance, which might include paying fines, wearing sackcloth, or being paraded through the streets. In Spain, the Inquisition paid close attention to dietary habits. Eating meat on Friday was a red flag, sometimes even cited as evidence of heresy or Jewish practice, a dangerous accusation in an era of forced conversions and religious paranoia. Meanwhile, monasteries maintained detailed logs of meals and food storage, lest anyone stray from the calendar. The refectories weren't just dining halls, they were places of quiet surveillance. Monks weren't allowed to talk during meals, but make no mistake, everyone was watching. Now, to be fair, not all fasts were ironclad. The church made exceptions for the sick, the elderly, the very young, and pregnant women. But even these exemptions came with documentation and ecclesiastical oversight. Doctors, and remember, this was the era when urine color was a diagnostic tool, had to provide written permission for someone to eat meat while ill. And the spiritual consequences had to be weighed carefully. Was it better to die faithful or live with a belly full of bacon? For some, the answer was death. There are recorded cases of devout individuals refusing meat on their deathbeds, believing that even a single bite could jeopardize their souls. Imagine that. A world where salvation might hinge on whether you touched lamb stew on a Friday. It wasn't just food. It was eternity. Fast forward a bit, and the story gets even more global. When European colonists spread Catholicism to the Americas, they brought their food taboos with them. Missionaries in the Andes taught fasting rules to indigenous converts. Jesuits in China debated which local animals counted as fish. French colonists in Canada introduced cod fisheries as both economic ventures and spiritual services. And in a weird twist of history, this very religious rule helped fuel the Atlantic cod trade, which became a backbone of imperial commerce. Even global cuisines were bent around the medieval obsession with fasting. The bacalhau, salt cod, dishes of Portugal, the fish-rich cuisines of parts of Catholic Africa and Latin America, all of them trace back, in part, to the European desire to avoid meat without giving up taste. We might laugh at medieval people believing that beavers were fish, or sculpting fish into geese, or counting barnacle birds as seafood. But the underlying impulse to control appetite as a symbol of virtue hasn't gone away. Today, we still grapple with guilt around food, moral judgments tied to eating, and the idea that what we consume defines our character. Swap sinful for unhealthy. Swap fasting for cleansing. And the logic remains eerily similar. Medieval people didn't hate food. They feared what it did to their souls. We fear what it does to our bodies, or our social image, or our sense of self-worth. It's all different flavors of the same feast. If the streets of medieval Europe smelled of piety and fish oil, the abbeys smelled of something far richer: roasted almonds, honey-glazed trout, and the gentle sizzle of butter in a pan. You might expect the monastic life to be one of asceticism, rough cloaks, hard benches, and bowls of porridge. But step into the refectory of a Benedictine monastery in the 12th century, and you'd be forgiven for thinking you'd wandered into the banquet hall of a minor noble. Because when it came to food, the monks, the very stewards of spiritual discipline, were the quiet gluttons of Christendom. And yes, the irony was thick enough to spread on bread. That let's begin with the Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century. This foundational text laid out the expectations of monastic life, and its prescriptions on eating were clear. Monks were to avoid excess. They should eat simply, usually just 1 or 2 meals a day, and ideally avoid meat from four-legged animals altogether. Fish, vegetables, fruit, and bread were the staples of the godly diet. It was about temperance, humility, and detachment from worldly pleasures. But here's the rub. Monks were not just readers of holy texts. They were also very clever readers of rules. If Saint Benedict said no meat from four-legged animals, well, poultry didn't have 4 legs. Now did it? Neither did fish. And so began a centuries-long culinary loophole expedition, a theological tug-of-war between appetite and abstinence. The medieval monastery evolved into a fortress of dietary exceptions. By the 13th century, monastic kitchens were among the best stocked in Europe. Some abbeys had their own fisheries, vineyards, apiaries, and bakeries. Wealthy patrons donated not just land but livestock, cows, pigs, deer, for the monks to, well, definitely not eat, of course, unless the abbot was sick, or it was a holiday, or a visiting bishop came by, or it was technically not the refectory, but a separate, private dining chamber. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a Thursday evening and one of the monks happened to have a slight cough. The human soul, as it turns out, has a remarkable way of justifying second helpings. Accounts from medieval observers and church reformers often described monastic meals with both envy and horror. One chronicler in 12th century France lamented that monks who had pledged poverty were dining on spiced meats and sweetened wines more suitable for emperors than men of the cloth. Another noted a Cistercian kitchen that consumed more meat in a month than a small village might see in a year. And yet, the monks saw themselves as entirely within the boundaries of righteousness. They were not indulging, merely obeying different categories of religious law. This wasn't feasting, it was regulated nourishment. And if one monastery felt a certain recipe was a bit too worldly, they might simply trade it with another abbey down the road. It was a spiritual form of culinary outsourcing. Some of the most elaborate medieval recipes were born in monastic kitchens. Honey roasted eel, walnut sauce with pickled herring, pastries stuffed with spiced dates and almond paste. These weren't desperate meals of pious starvation. They were full-bodied expressions of culture, wealth, and influence. But while monks enjoyed their fish-filled fasts behind stone walls, peasants starved on turnips and weevil-ridden barley. This disparity wasn't lost on reformers, either. Throughout the later Middle Ages, movements arose, particularly within the Franciscans and the Lollards, that criticized the excessive comforts of monastery life. Their tracts and sermons fumed against fat friars with gout and golden goblets, demanding a return to real asceticism. Some even claimed that the devil had entered the church not through sin of the flesh, but sin of the forked. By the late 1400s, the hypocrisy of clerical indulgence became a common theme in satire and art. In illuminated manuscripts and woodcut prints, artists depicted fat monks clutching hams, dozing over wine goblets, or sneaking bites between prayers. The image of the gluttonous monk became cultural shorthand for religious corruption. Still, within their cloisters, the feasting continued, albeit under more careful supervision. Monks might claim that meals were silent, regulated, and always eaten in moderation. But beneath those vaulted ceilings, beneath the soft chants of vespers, was the quiet clink of cutlery and the unmistakable scent of roasting goose. And let's not forget the holy loophole of bloodletting. According to some abbey records, a monk who had undergone the procedure, which was common in medieval medicine, could be exempt from fasting restrictions. The result? Monks arranged their bloodletting schedules strategically, often coordinating with feasting days. Who knew that draining a few ounces of blood could entitle you to roast lamb and buttery fritters? By the time we reached the dawn of the Reformation, the indulgent dining habits of the clergy, especially monks, were among the key grievances voiced by Protestant leaders. Martin Luther himself had once been a monk, and he knew what went on in those kitchens. His criticism wasn't just theological, it was personal and likely a little indigestion-based. While the medieval world publicly venerated fasting, restraint, and the purification of the flesh, its most holy men quietly carved stakes behind stone walls. The table, after all, is as much a battlefield of the soul as the confessional. But perhaps the most curious thing about the monks' gastronomic theology wasn't the loopholes. It was how holy they made indulgence look. Imagine entering a Cluniac monastery in Burgundy in the 11th century. You'd hear the echoes of Gregorian chant filling the corridors, smell a warm aroma of fresh bread and herbs from the kitchen, and find yourself watching a dozen robed men sitting in utter silence, eating slow-roasted salmon with almond crust. The sacred stillness almost made the luxury invisible, as if the lack of conversation turned a feast into a prayer. This wasn't gluttony, they would say. This was contemplative chewing. And just in case there was any guilt left on the plate, someone always read scripture aloud during meals, a practice called collation. Verses on humility, sacrifice, and the suffering of Christ were recited over courses of honey-cooked pears and candied violets. In a way, the Word of God became the spiritual garnish. Even their fasts weren't always what they seemed. Some monasteries had such detailed fast day menus that the average monk probably gained weight during Lent. There were recipes specifically designed to be technically meatless but calorically sinful. Fried cheese balls, butter-drenched, fish pies, and thick almond milk stews with raisins and egg yolks disguised as cream, all devoured under banners proclaiming the virtue of restraint. And this culinary arms race wasn't just about taste. It was a statement of status. Monasteries were not just centers of prayer, they were economic powerhouses. Some controlled dozens of farms, fisheries, vineyards, and tithes from entire regions. Their feasts were symbols of wealth, influence, and divine favor. In a world where everything was a metaphor for salvation or damnation, an elaborate meal could whisper, "We are the elect. God provides for us. Richly to justify this." Monks leaned heavily on the idea of intention. If you didn't mean to indulge, you weren't sinning. If you felt guilty afterward, you were even holier. And if you donated a crust of bread to a beggar after dessert, well, perhaps you had canceled out the roasted peacock you just ate. This theology of edible absolution shaped centuries of behavior, but it wasn't without consequences. As monastic, feasting became increasingly notorious, so too did the satire. In England, tales spread of friars who visited nobles' homes during Lent and conveniently forgot their fasting vows. In France, caricatures depicted monks sneaking pies into their robes. In Germany, A popular woodcut shows a monk praying before a roast chicken as though it were a relic. The criticism wasn't just from outsiders. Reforming orders, like the Cistercians, originally prided themselves on simplicity and austerity. Yet even they couldn't resist the call of the culinary. Within a century of their founding, the Cistercians were being accused of building aqueducts, not for irrigation, but to supply their trout ponds. Perhaps the most amusing example of this holy indulgence comes from the Abbey of Westminster. There, historical records from the 14th century detail the allocation of food during feast days. Gallons of ale, hundreds of fish, and barrels of imported spices. On certain holy days, each monk was allowed 2 swans. Swans, the very bird that poets wrote sonnets about. Roasted, served with pepper sauce, and eaten under candlelight in a room where silence was enforced, but only for the mouth, not the stomach. And if you're wondering, yes, there were consequences to all this eating. Obesity among monks became common, especially in older age. Monastic infirmaries often treated illnesses related to overconsumption, gout, digestive distress, even hernias from lifting heavy platters. But again, suffering was a form of purification, wasn't it? So it was that even the monk whose legs trembled from gout could be seen limping into the chapel, belly full, heart repentant. This duality, self-denial wrapped in indulgence, defined much of the medieval church's relationship with food. It wasn't simply a matter of what was eaten, but how, why, and under what pretense. The line between piety and parody became increasingly blurry, especially when the prayers were said with fish grease still glistening on one's lips. If food was a test of the soul, the monks of the Middle Ages were master examiners, writing new answers, correcting the margins, and sometimes eating the textbook. As monastic Europe feasted beneath frescoed ceilings, there lingered a sense of cosmic imbalance. Outside those thick stone walls, peasants were scouring fields for wild herbs and nibbling crusts that had more mold than bread. Their diet was dominated by gruel, onions, and hope. And yet, the very men who preached poverty and humility were the ones roasting eel and sipping honeyed wine in candlelit silence. And here lies the greatest irony of all. While monks justified their meals with scripture, peasants were burdened with guilt for wanting second helpings of barley soup. Fasting, for the working poor, wasn't a matter of virtue. It was survival. Yet the church told them to fast as penance, as if their involuntary hunger made them closer to God. Meanwhile, within abbeys, fasting days became culinary puzzles to solve. How can we avoid meat while still eating like kings? This spiritual gymnastics became embedded in medieval culture. Entire religious calendars were marked not by saints, but by diet. Ember days, rogation days, Advent, Lent, all opportunities for prescribed hunger. But that hunger meant one thing for the rich and something else entirely for the poor, that in many cases, monasteries even profited from their gluttony. They brewed and sold beer, traded cheese and cured meats, and made fortunes off food production while condemning excess in sermons. Their abbey markets sold luxuries to nobles, preserved fruit, spiced sauces, even imported delicacies like dates or saffron, while tithing the surrounding villages into starvation. Even fish, the ultimate loophole in the no-meat rule, became a luxury. Monks built elaborate fish ponds, stocked with pike, perch, and carp. They engineered flow systems to keep the water clean and selectively bred the fish for taste and fat content. One famous abbey in Central Europe had over 30 ponds and produced more fish than some coastal towns by the 14th century. The church's obsession with fish was both theological and economic. Fish wasn't just sustenance, it was sacred commerce. And wherever there's sacred commerce, there's corruption. Some monks took bribes in barrels of sturgeon. Some abbots dined with nobility, advising them on which fast day dishes would be most pleasing to both palate and pope. The lines between abbey and court grew so thin you could barely tell where the psalm ended and the menu began. And yet, perhaps the most poetic contradiction of all was that these monks genuinely believed they were doing good. They weren't scheming villains rubbing their hands over roast ducks. They were men raised in a system that taught them to interpret the rules, not defy them. They prayed before meals. They gave thanks. They whispered hymns while chewing goose. They donated their leftovers to the poor and felt, in their souls, that they were upholding divine order. It's hard to say if they were hypocrites or merely humans, flawed, hungry, and wrapped in the complexities of a faith that treated food as both sacrament and sin. The medieval monk lived in a world where salvation might lie in your stomach just as much as your heart. And in that cloistered silence, filled with the scent of herbs, the flicker of candlelight, and the echo of Latin chants, you might find a man trying to chew quietly, hoping God wouldn't notice the glint of gravy on his chin. If you were a peasant in 13th century Europe, sin wasn't just something you confessed in church. It was something you accidentally committed 3 times a day at mealtime. While nobles and monks performed theological gymnastics over which fish counted as meat, common folk were simply trying to fill their bellies with anything that wouldn't get them excommunicated or sick. In theory, the church taught that gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins. In practice, however, gluttony was a sin that required resources to commit. Peasants didn't have enough food to sin with. Yet this didn't stop the church from holding them to the same rigid standards of fasts, holy days, and dietary purity that a villager who had worked 12 hours digging in frozen fields might return home to find his only meal was coarse barley, bread, a cabbage boiled with onion, and maybe, if luck smiled, a sliver of salted pork. But on Fridays or Lent, that pork became illicit, a spiritual liability rather than sustenance. The expectations were absurd. Fasting days could number over 100 per year, and during those times, meat, dairy, and even eggs were forbidden. But livestock didn't stop producing milk just because it was a holy day. Eggs didn't check the liturgical calendar before hatching. And so, villagers often faced a quiet, impossible dilemma: break the fast or feed your children. Of course, there were options. You could substitute fish if you lived near a river, or you could buy fish if you could afford it. But for most peasants, fish was an aristocratic fantasy. Salted herring might appear at market, but it was often so heavily preserved it resembled leather more than meat. Cheaper alternatives, like eel or lamprey, were prized by the wealthy and rarely available in quantity to the poor, so the poor turned to what they always had: ingenuity. In desperation, field snails became Lenten staples. Frogs, technically not meat, were fair game. And so were hedgehogs, roasted over fire and scraped clean of spines. Was it spiritually sound? Questionable. Was it edible? Barely. But it was food. And for a laborer facing 6 more days of planting wheat in freezing mud, that mattered more than heavenly reward. Despite these harsh realities, church enforcement remained unforgiving. Parish priests, especially those loyal to reform movements, could, and did, report food violations. Villagers caught breaking the fast were fined or shamed, sometimes publicly, and worst of all, branded as unrepentant sinners. In the church's eyes, hunger didn't excuse disobedience. It just made the temptation more revealing. And then there was the street food. Yes, medieval cities had it: bubbling pots of stew from roadside vendors, cheap pies sold by shouting boys, pickled vegetables, fish cakes, and porridge carts. These foods were the lifeblood of peasants, workers, and travelers. But many of these items, especially during religious holidays, were watched with suspicion, some street vendors disguised meat pies as fish ones. Others used animal fat in doughs when butter was forbidden. And while local authorities often looked the other way, especially if bribed, church officials did not. Street vendors could be fined, punished, or have their carts confiscated. The sin, after all, wasn't in selling the meat pie. It was in causing others to sin by eating it. This created an ironic black market of food morality. You could buy Friday pies that came with verbal assurances. No meat, I swear upon the Virgin. Whether that was true depended on the honesty of a cook with rent due. Meanwhile, peasants, who lacked theological training and couldn't read Latin dietary rules, struggled with what was even permitted. Could they eat goose fat on a fasting day? Were oysters okay? What if a stew contained bone broth, but no meat? The rules were opaque, and yet enforced as if they were carved into the Ten Commandments. The most telling moment of this daily struggle came at the communal table. Peasants often ate together, families, neighbors, even entire villages during feasts. But during fast days, the mood changed. Eyes glanced nervously at one another's plates. Was that butter in that porridge? Did someone sneak sausage into the stew? Religious fear slithered across the table like an invisible serpent. You couldn't just eat. You had to eat correctly. And doing it wrong didn't just bring shame, it brought sin. The kind you had to confess. The kind you might be punished for. The kind that could, theoretically, damn you. The irony was this. The poor, who had the least food, were judged the most harshly. Nobles had confessors to rationalize a goose as a large aquatic bird. Monks had elaborate treatises on the caloric ambiguity of cheese. But a farmer who cooked a pot of lentils with ham because he had nothing else? He might be told his soul was at risk. And so, the medieval obsession with the sin of eating wasn't just a cultural quirk. It was a system of control, a way to monitor bodies through their appetites, to divide people not just by class, but by cuisine. There's a tragic absurdity in this. A society where gluttony was condemned, hunger was common, and yet eating itself was treated like a minefield of moral peril, where street pies could lead to salvation or sin, where a peasant mother might fast for days not because she wanted to, but because she feared what might happen if she didn't. The people of the Middle Ages may not have always understood theology, but they knew this much. Sin was everywhere, even on your dinner plate. And the church? It wasn't just feeding souls. It was seasoning every bite with fear. Yet despite all the scrutiny, food remained central to the rhythms of medieval urban life. Markets bustled, stew pots steamed, and vendors hawked their wares with gusto. It wasn't just about survival. It was about identity, culture, and comfort. A hot pie on a cold day, a slice of flatbread with onions, a mug of weak ale. These were small pleasures in a world where joy was often rationed. But the church had a way of shadowing even those pleasures. Street festivals, once lively affairs, with food carts and jugglers, became moral minefields. Did that cheese tart contain egg? Was that stew thickened with marrow? Priests warned that eternal damnation might be lurking beneath that perfectly golden crust. In some cities, roaming, officials actually performed taste inspections during major fasts. Imagine it, a frazzled bishop's aide poking a pastry with suspicion, sniffing it as though it might explode in heresy. The rules could be laughable, except no one was laughing. For a poor widow trying to sell meat pies on a Friday just to feed her children, these decrees weren't theological puzzles. They were life or death. There was also the ever-present fear of gossip. In small towns, reputations were brittle things. That woman boiled a chicken on Good Friday. Someone might whisper. Suddenly, you weren't just a sinner, you were that sinner. Your stall was avoided. Your family shunned. The church didn't always need to act. The community did it for them. And still, people found ways to bend the rules. Creative peasant cooks mastered the art of culinary camouflage. Meat was minced, seasoned, and reshaped to look like fish. Butter was accidentally included in Lenten stews. A bit of chicken fat made its way into a crust for texture. Everyone knew. No one admitted it. The tension wasn't just between hunger and holiness. It was between doctrine and dignity. For many peasants, breaking fast wasn't rebellion. It was survival. The church told them they needed to suffer, to suppress their desires, to offer their hunger as penance. But try telling that to a mother whose child is crying for food on a day that forbids cheese. Meanwhile, the nobility had a loophole for everything. They employed theologians to interpret dietary law. In their favor, had personal confessors to erase their accidents, and hosted lavish, meatless feasts that were anything but modest. Salmon stuffed with herbs and honey-glazed eel weren't exactly sacrifices. Yet the church turned a blind eye. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on the peasants. They heard the sermons. They knew the laws. But they also saw the abbot's table piled high with delicacies on a fast day while their own was bare. And they couldn't help but ask, was God really so interested in what passed through their mouths? Or was someone else benefiting from their fear? Even peasant humor turned on the subject. Folk tales circulated about greedy friars who mistook a rat for a fish, or saints who miraculously turned forbidden sausages into loaves of bread when cornered. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were subtle acts of defiance, spiritual satire for a people who knew how ridiculous it all was, but couldn't openly say so. By the end of the 14th century, this tension had become a cultural undercurrent. The more the church preached restraint, the more ordinary people learned to bend, twist, and sometimes break the rules. Quiet rebellion was served hot, seasoned with guilt, and washed down with a mug of diluted ale. But beneath the laughter, the tricks, and the whispered jokes, the fear remained. The fear of damnation, of excommunication, of unknowingly committing a mortal sin over a bit of pork in a stew. For peasants, eating was never just eating. It was a moral act, a daily test, a line walked between temptation and obedience. The stomach growled, but the soul had to answer. And in the end, even the simplest crust of bread could carry the weight of heaven or hell. To truly understand how food became a battlefield for the medieval soul, you must begin with the calendar. Not a personal planner or a simple page of dates, but a holy map, etched with obligations, dotted with sacred days, and absolutely packed with rules about what, when, and how to eat. Forget meal prepping. If you lived in medieval Europe, the church had already meal prepped your entire year. The heart of it all was fasting. But this wasn't the trendy, intermittent fasting you've heard of today. This was not about health, metabolism, or willpower. This was about sin. To fast meant to deny the flesh, to refuse the desires that bound man to the earthly and drag him away from the divine. And food, rich, fatty, savory food, was enemy number one. The medieval fasting calendar was a monster of discipline. Lent alone consumed 40 consecutive days, not including Sundays. Advent followed. Ember days, rogation days, saints' vigils, and countless local observances stacked up one after another. In some regions, a devout Christian could fast nearly half the year, and fasting didn't mean eating less. It meant eating differently. Meat was out, so were animal fats. Eggs were banned. Dairy was frowned upon, if not outright forbidden. In theory, this meant meals of vegetables, grains, and water. In practice, well, humanity got creative, but before we get to the loopholes, picture the mindset. To fast was to imitate Christ. To suffer at the table was to purify the soul. The discomfort of a grumbling stomach was interpreted as a kind of holy music, a humbling reminder of mankind's fallen nature. Entire sermons were preached on the dangers of flavor. Yes, flavor. Priests warned that even fasting dishes could be too tempting, too indulgent. If a Lenten stew had just the right amount of spice, was that really mortification of the flesh? It was a culinary tightrope, walked in fear. Even monasteries, with their regulated schedules and strict codes, struggled. Monks debated over whether almond milk was too luxurious during a fast. Some records show they avoided figs because their sweetness made them feel guilty. A fruit, making you feel guilty. Then came the royal courts and upper clergy. These weren't humble souls eating gruel. These were educated men and women, well aware of the rules and well practiced in reinterpretation. The fish course? Yes, it was still fish, but it might be eel roasted in saffron butter, or trout stuffed with almonds and raisins, or pike poached in wine and served with candied turnips. Nothing about it said penance. But technically, no meat. Even more absurd was the invention of mock meat for fast days. This wasn't about pretending, it was about subverting. Chefs learned to sculpt fish into the shape of roasted birds. Pastry crusts were filled with mushrooms and dyed red to look like pork. In some banquet records, we find references to entire boars made of minced fish, molded with bread paste, and painted to glisten like roast pork. Deception? Maybe. But divine deception, blessed by omission. There was even debate on whether beaver counted as fish. Why? Because it had a tail. Yes, that was the logic. In 1215, clerics in southern France ruled that beaver, being part aquatic, could be eaten on fast days. Other regions extended the privilege to otters, barnacle, geese, believed to hatch from barnacles, and thus not quite birds, and even dolphins. It's not a stretch to say that theology sometimes bent to the convenience of appetite, but for the common folk, fasting was rarely so clever or delicious. Their Lenten diets were truly meager: boiled beans, black bread, root vegetables, and, if they were lucky, a bit of dried herring. There were no saffron-glazed eels for them. Theirs was a fast in spirit and in substance. Still, even they tried to make do. Markets during Lent offered more fish than any other time of year. Dried cod from Scandinavia, pickled herring from the North Sea, and freshwater carp from local ponds became staples. In wealthier towns, you might even find imported sturgeon or salted tuna. The fishmongers, as you might imagine, were thrilled. Some towns even created fish farms specifically to meet demand during fasts. Monasteries dug fish ponds on their grounds, turning fasting into a kind of divine aquaculture. Eels became a religious investment. Carp became holy commerce. The church may have banned meat, but it had indirectly created a booming seafood industry. There were consequences, of course. Overfishing, collapsed river ecosystems, the occasional scandal when monks were caught secretly eating meat during Lent and were shamed in public. But the system trudged on, calendar page after calendar page, year after year. Children were taught from a young age to memorize fasting rules, what could be eaten and when. Some had rhymes or songs to help them remember. And heaven forbid you forgot and were caught with butter in your stew on a forbidden day. The church was forgiving, of course, for a price. Many parishes offered indulgences in exchange for culinary sins. A few coins to the right friar, and your transgression vanished like steam from a soup pot. Yet what lingers most from these centuries of fasting isn't the food, it's the fear. The constant anxiety that you might be indulging too much. That, Joy itself was suspect. That to savor a meal was to edge closer to damnation. The body wanted one thing. The soul was told to want another. And the calendar kept the pressure on, day by day, dish by dish. It was an era where dining became devotional, where flavor could damn you, and where something as innocent as a fried egg might send you on a fast track to purgatory, and the church didn't need to watch you. You watched yourself. If the church calendar was the map of salvation, then every bite taken outside its boundaries was like stepping off a cliff. And it was your fault for not watching where you were going. And watch. They did. Ecclesiastical authorities were serious about fasting enforcement. In some towns, bishops appointed meat wardens or carnispectors who patrolled markets and kitchens during Lent, sniffing for contraband sausages or peeking into cauldrons suspiciously full of animal bones. In England, public proclamations were made before Lent began, reminding citizens that the sin of gluttony lurked in every unregulated spoonful. And the punishment wasn't merely spiritual. A butcher caught selling forbidden meats could be fined, publicly shamed, or even jailed. One documented case from 14th century Paris involved a noblewoman found roasting a chicken on Good Friday. She claimed, rather weakly, that she had mistaken the day. But the bishop's court did not take kindly to culinary forgetfulness. She was fined heavily and forced to walk barefoot to mass and penance, followed by jeering townspeople, some of whom probably weren't fasting all that devoutly themselves. But perhaps the greatest irony of medieval fasting was this: the more the church tried to suppress pleasure in eating, the more elaborate it became. Cookbooks from the 14th and 15th centuries are full of recipes designed specifically for fast days. Lavish cookery texts like the Viandier of Taillevent or Libro de Arte Coquinaria offered dozens of meatless dishes featuring almond milk, rice, sugar, spices, fish, and fruits, constructed with such care that only the truly pious could say they weren't enjoying themselves. And then there were the loopholes. Oh, the glorious, divinely bureaucratic loopholes. Some monasteries found ways to eat meat without eating meat. For example, roasting animal organs, considered lesser parts, was sometimes allowed on special fasts. Others interpreted fasting as applying only to solid food. So rich broths, meat-flavored porridges, and thick stews were considered fair game. Technically liquid, still others, especially nobles, simply found ways around the rules with cash. If fasting interfered with their health, or their diplomatic dinners, or their important hunts, they could buy dispensations. Pay a certain amount to a bishop or monastery, and you'd receive a signed document exempting you from fasting obligations. It's like medieval DoorDash with a spiritual coupon. At the royal level, some kings even made fasting political. Edward III of England issued a decree that fish should be eaten for the benefit of the fisheries. Suddenly, eating Lenten cod wasn't just pious, it was patriotic. The church and crown aligned in a curious moment of holy nationalism. Over dried fish that, of course, peasants could rarely afford indulgences, nor did they have access to fine fish or fancy loopholes. For them, fasting meant real hunger. A winter of dwindling food stores made Lent especially brutal. In years of poor harvests, the church's rules became a double bind. Either you broke the fast and sinned, or you kept it and starved. There are recorded instances of peasants boiling tree bark during Lent. Some tried eating fermented cabbage or foraged herbs with clay. Others drank ale for calories, even as priests warned that drunkenness on a fast day was doubly sinful. There were no easy choices, just survival or salvation. And yet, even amid scarcity, there was reverence. Many believed that their suffering mattered, that it purified their souls, and shortened their time in purgatory. Some fasted more strictly than required. Others voluntarily added extra days of abstinence. The line between devotion and masochism became blurred. Fasting wasn't just about food anymore. It became identity. It was who you were before God, a body denied, a soul exalted. By the late Middle Ages, fasting had become almost theatrical. In public feasts, food was segregated. One table would serve clean dishes for non-fasting guests, while another offered Lenten fare. Servants announced each dish with ritual for the fast. Some nobles hosted symbolic meals of plain beans and black bread, eaten in full view of the poor, then retired to private chambers for a second, more luxurious course. This double life was not uncommon. In cities, tensions brewed. Fish markets raised prices dramatically during fasting seasons. Dried cod that sold for a penny in January might fetch 4 times that in March. The poor grumbled, the fishmongers profited, and the church quietly benefited from the taxes. If there's a medieval version of sin economy, this was it. Artists and satirists of the time weren't blind to this hypocrisy. In manuscripts and church murals, we find curious scenes. Monks sneaking meat behind altars, pigs dressed as priests, and fish with halos. One famous German woodcut depicts the devil roasting a Lenten fish while whispering into a bishop's ear. Food, once sacred, had become political, comical, and tragically human. And then came the Reformation. Martin Luther and his fellow reformers were disgusted by the excesses of fasting. To them, the elaborate Lenten dishes, the purchased exemptions, the legal loopholes, these were not signs of faith, but of rot. The fasting calendar, they claimed, had become a cage built by men, not God. In many Protestant regions, fasting days were abolished. Meat returned to Friday tables. Fishmongers wept, but the Catholic Church, staunch and unmoved, clung to its culinary codes. Fasting remained a sacrament. The Council of Trent reaffirmed it in the mid-16th century. The calendar remained packed, with reminders that eating was not merely biological, it was spiritual. Even today, echoes remain. Catholics still fast during Lent, albeit in softened forms. Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, Meatless Fridays. These are the dusty footprints of a once vast empire of dietary control. And yet, perhaps the strangest legacy of medieval fasting is psychological, the guilt of indulgence, the fear of appetite, the suspicion of pleasure. These are ideas that didn't die with the Middle Ages. In many ways, they grew more refined, evolving into diet culture, food shaming, ascetic health trends. The body is still something we try to control. The soul still something we hope to clean. Next time you feel guilty for ordering dessert, remember, you're part of a long, strange tradition. And somewhere in a dusty manuscript, a monk is still debating whether a poached pear counts as a sin. If the medieval church made gluttony a sin, then starvation became something dangerously close to virtue. In the grand theater of medieval life, no one understood the performance of eating, or rather, not eating, better than the saints. And while kings dined behind golden doors and popes justified second helpings as divine fuel, a quieter, holier war was being fought on empty stomachs. Let us begin with Saint Catherine of Siena, perhaps the most famous of the so-called holy anorexics. In an age where food meant flesh, and flesh meant sin, she chose abstinence as her sword. Her meals? A few herbs, a spoonful of bitter vegetables, sometimes not even water. When questioned, she claimed that her hunger was for God, not for bread. Physicians begged her to eat. Priests worried. Her family despaired. But she insisted eating was for bodies. She was trying to become something beyond that by the time she died at age 33, exhausted, emaciated, and revered. She was a saint in the eyes of many, and a terrifying inspiration to others. Catherine was not alone. Saint Angela of Foligno claimed to have eaten only the Eucharist for years, describing the holy wafer as a food that burns the mouth with divine fire. Saint Wilgefortis, a bearded female martyr, is said to have fasted herself to death to avoid marriage. And then there was Saint Ludwina of Schiedam, who, after a fall on the ice, chose suffering as her lifelong diet. For 38 years, she lived off small sips of wine and a few crumbs of bread, eaten only when ordered by her confessor. These women weren't merely devout. They were celebrities. Hagiographies, stories of the saints, celebrated their starvation as proof of purity. The less they ate, the closer to God they became. Some were said to have survived on heavenly fragrances or visions of Christ alone. Food was replaced by ecstasy. Fasting became a miracle. And yet, in every village and monastery, such holy suffering coexisted with very real gluttony, especially in those who claimed to renounce it. That let's talk monks that in theory, monastic life was simple, ora et labora, pray and work, a modest life, modest food, modest needs. But as monasteries grew richer, thanks to tithes, donations, and land grants, the tables of abbots and their brethren became less than modest. That a 14th century satire from England mocked the fat friars of Flanders, describing how their robes split from the girth and their sandals strained beneath their blessed bellies. A bishop's banquet was sometimes grander than a royal one. Chronicles from the Cluniac and Benedictine orders list feasts with 5 courses, fish and almond sauce, jellied fruits, spiced wines, and even imported cheeses from southern Italy. One particularly extravagant monastery had its own menu calendar, a rotating plan of fasts and feasts designed not to humble the body, but to trick it. On Mondays, they ate dried fish. On Tuesdays, eel pie. On Wednesdays, wine with figs. Thursdays were for trout. Fridays, of course, were penitential, just 2 courses instead of 3. Some tried to rationalize. We must eat well to pray well, one monk wrote. Another argued that gluttony was a sin. Yes, but so was wasting food. Better to finish the feast than let God's creation rot. Clever, no? And outside the cloistered walls, the people watched. They watched as starving peasants queued outside abbey gates, begging for crusts. They watched as monks grew fatter, more powerful, more distant from the God they preached. The contradiction was not lost on them. That it's no surprise, then, that, in the popular imagination, the fat monk became a stock character, jolly, hypocritical, sneaking meat pies into candlelit cloisters. In art, in theater, even in the margins of religious texts, you'd find Brother Belly, grinning behind goblets, chewing through sermons. But perhaps the most bizarre collision of starvation and sanctity occurred when monarchs decided to compete. With saints, King Louis IX of France, St. Louis, took fasting so seriously that his confessor begged him to stop, not because it was unhealthy, but because he was showing up the church. Louis wore hair shirts, slept on straw, and ate only after feeding the poor. He reportedly gave away entire royal meals, then dined on broth with stale bread, just like Christ, he claimed. Of course, his cooks still prepared the full feast, just in case guests arrived. Even more performative was King Henry III of Castile, who during Lent refused to touch meat at all, except to personally serve it to others. Meanwhile, he had secret feasts sent to a back chamber, where he would inspect them at great length. You see, royal fasting wasn't really about sin. It was about optics. A pious king was a powerful king. A starving king? Practically untouchable. But the peasants who actually starved weren't sanctified. They were forgotten. Their bodies wasted not for God, but for taxes. While saints purified themselves through hunger, the poor were being punished by it. Still, the cult of self-denial flourished. Fasting was the medieval version of virtue signaling, loud, public, and judged. Who fasted more? Who suffered longer? Who could be closer to God by giving up food? In some towns, competition became absurd. There are reports of nuns competing to eat only ashes. Monks tried to outdo each other by sleeping in cold stone corridors without supper. A few extreme sects practiced total mortification, whipping themselves while fasting, believing that only through bodily agony could the soul ascend. And yet, this agony was admired. Saints were canonized. Shrines were built. Pilgrims walked for miles to touch a piece of bone belonging to a woman who hadn't eaten in 20 years. Stories spread of saints glowing in the dark, levitating during fasts, or smelling like roses after death. That it was a holy hunger, a beautiful suffering, and a terrifying lesson. In medieval Europe, your worth before God was measured not by how full your plate was, but by how long you could leave it empty. And while saints wasted away to prove their devotion, the churches, earthly representatives grew, well-fed. In the grand halls of power, where gold chalices glittered under candlelight and incense masked the stench of unwashed flesh, one could easily mistake a cardinal's dinner for an emperor's. Bishops with swollen fingers loaded with jeweled rings signed indulgences after polishing off goose liver pate. Austerity. That was for the stained-glass saints, not the clergy, who debated theology over spiced mulled wine and roasted peacock. Even papal courts were not immune. In Avignon during the 14th century, the Babylonian captivity of the church, the papal household consumed such vast quantities of meat, sweets, and imported delicacies that entire districts were devoted to food logistics alone. Papal chefs, many of them French, prepared intricate menus filled with stewed boar, sugar-dusted fruit confections, and wines imported from Spain and Naples. Meanwhile, across the river, the poor lined up for crumbs and blessings. But perhaps nothing captures the hypocrisy more clearly than the church's fascination with controlling how everyone else ate. Clergy thundered from pulpits about the dangers of gluttony, condemning the very meals they'd just finished digesting. Sumptuary laws, encouraged by church advisors, dictated what the laity could and could not eat. Feast days were defined, fast days enforced, and the calendar groaned under the weight of conflicting instructions. Feast like kings on saints' days. Starve like monks on Fridays. For the average medieval Christian, it was exhausting. You weren't just eating anymore. You were navigating a minefield of moral peril. Did that sausage violate a vigil? Did the goose count as poultry or fish? Was that almond milk blessed by a monk or made by your neighbor's cousin's second wife, who might be a heretic? Better confess, just in case. Confession itself became a digestive affair. Priests demanded details. Did you eat meat on a fast day? Did you break your Lenten vow with a spoonful of cream? One 13th century confessor's manual even recommended specific penances based on what kind of meat you'd eaten illicitly, beef being far more sinful than chicken. And don't even think about bacon. That was practically heresy in a pan. Meanwhile, back in the monasteries and bishoprics, the elite dined with increasing sophistication. By the 15th century, religious orders owned vast kitchen gardens, fisheries, and vineyards. Meals became performances. Courses were served in order of piety. Fish first, then vegetables, then the permitted meats, only on feast days, of course. And then, should anyone still feel spiritually secure, Desserts fashioned into the shapes of saints, animals, or miniature cathedrals. One Italian abbey even held an annual contest. Which monk could sculpt the most biblical-looking butter sculpture? The winner received a blessing and a second helping. Yet beneath the humor lies a darker truth. For the medieval elite, religious or royal, asceticism was an option. Hunger could be chosen, displayed, and then broken with a ritual. But for most of the population, hunger was simply reality. There was no theological dignity in being poor. No canonization for the peasant who fasted because the granary was empty. No miracle for the mother who fed her child boiled weeds. Saints starved and were worshipped. Serfs starved and were buried. And thus, we find ourselves staring at a spiritual paradox. A religion that told you food was both a blessing and a trap, a need and a test, a gift from God and a temptation of the devil. You had to eat to live, but eat wrongly, and you die eternally. And so, people lived with the anxiety of every bite. Meat was a risk, butter was a burden, and the richest man in town might feel less secure in heaven than the madwoman in rags who lived off roots. And visions that it was a world where gluttony could damn you, and starvation could save you. And somewhere between the golden chalices and empty bowls, between saints glowing with piety and kings bloated with power, Europe learned to moralize the menu and fear the feast. You'd think that after centuries of fasting, guilt, and ecclesiastical food policing, people would learn to just eat their gruel and move on. But alas, medieval Europe was nothing if not creative in finding ways to turn morality into a market. And even the dinner plate wasn't safe. Welcome to the unholy alliance of food, fear, and finance, where indulgences were bought by the bite, guilt was measured by the goblet, and salvation could be weighed in salted pork. That be why the late Middle Ages. The church had perfected a system that monetized penance. Want forgiveness? Fantastic. Here's your menu. You could fast for 3 days, walk barefoot to a shrine, or, if you were wealthy, simply pay a fee and keep chewing. This indulgence economy flourished, not just for sins of the soul, but for those of the stomach. Especially when the stomach was full of forbidden delights. Eating meat on a Friday wasn't just a theological misdemeanor. It was a financial opportunity. The local priest, well-versed in canon law and community gossip, could offer spiritual cleansing. For a price. Did you sneak a sausage during Lent? That's 2 silver pennies. Bacon on Good Friday? Make it 4. A roasted swan with cloves and saffron? Let's just say your grandchildren will be saying Hail Marys on your behalf. In some regions, especially in bustling towns with growing merchant classes, this system became remarkably structured. There were unofficial rates for indulgences related to food. Some clergy even kept charts. One chronicler from the Rhineland noted that in his village, eel was considered less sinful than lamb, but more sinful than carp. Wealthy guild members began calculating how many indulgences they'd need to balance out their banquet menus, like moral accountants tallying up roast quail and redemption. This blending of piety and profit naturally inspired criticism. Reformers, mystics, and the occasional fed-up monk accused the church of selling not salvation, but sanctified gluttony. After all, what good was a fast when the same bishop preaching self-denial was dining behind velvet curtains on stuffed pheasant and candied figs? But the system persisted and even expanded. Some indulgence sellers turned it into performance. In public squares, a friar might dramatize the dangers of eating flesh on holy days, describing in vivid, terrifying detail how a sinful soul was dragged into the fires of hell for the crime of licking goose fat from his fingers. Then, like a magician offering an escape from a locked box, he'd smile and pull out the solution. a letter of indulgence, stamped, signed, and blessed. Just a few coins, and your eternal indigestion would be cured. Even monasteries got involved. In the business, certain abbeys hosted special forgiveness feasts where nobles could dine luxuriously while also making generous donations to the church. Eat, drink, and be forgiven. One hand held a goblet of wine, the other a sealed pardon. The irony was so thick you could slice it with a consecrated knife. And let us not forget the burgeoning black market of holy loopholes that in cities like Florence and Paris. Some wealthy families commissioned personal confessors, priests who quietly absolved dietary sins in exchange for monthly retainers. These priests often dined with the families themselves, advising which dishes were theologically risky and which could be consumed with a clean conscience. A good confessor could make or break a dinner party. It's no wonder that when reformers, like Martin Luther, finally snapped in the early 16th century, one of their grievances was this very marketplace of mercy. To him, indulgences weren't about salvation, they were about indulgence. And nowhere was that clearer than in the church's kitchen. But even with critique and controversy, the idea endured. That food was never just food. It was moral. It was spiritual. It was a ledger entry in your divine accounting book. The result? A society where every bite could be bought, blessed, or burdened, where the line between hunger and heresy blurred, where a feast could damn your soul and a coin could save it. And as Europe inched closer to Reformation and upheaval, its people continued to dine under the shadow of guilt, the sound of coins clinking in the collection bowl, and the ever-present question, was that taste worth the toll? One of the most absurd contradictions in medieval religious life came not from peasant superstition or illiterate misinterpretation, but from the very institutions built to embody moral discipline. Monasteries, abbeys, and convents, those strongholds of humility and temperance, often transformed into temples of feasting cloaked in theology. Some monasteries went so far as to develop elaborate food codes. They did not abolish luxury, they renamed it. For example, meat might be banned under monastic rules, but what, precisely, was meat? According to several creative abbots, birds that nested in water were not animals of the land, and therefore not technically meat. So herons, ducks, even swans could be served in great quantity. In other words, the fish rule was fishy from the start. Then came the loopholes in the fasting calendar. Lent may have forbidden meat for 40 days, but monks were permitted a wide array of exceptions. One 14th century abbey kept a record of over 100 feast days per year that coincided with saints' days, local holy events, or spiritual emergencies that, somehow, demanded roast pork and fine claret. A pious brother, it seemed, was rarely more than a day away from divine justification for indulgence. Portion sizes? Also a matter of interpretation. An abbot in 13th century France noted in his diary that his monks were strictly rationed to 2 modest meals a day, but neglected to mention that one of these meals involved 8 courses, complete, with sweet wine, preserved fruits, and cheese wheels the size of cartwheels. One Italian monastery was recorded consuming more wine per capita than the nobility of Florence, all under the banner of liquid nourishment for contemplation. Even the architecture betrayed the stomach's sovereignty. Monasteries across Europe built massive kitchens, some with multiple hearths and ventilation systems rivaling noble houses. The great Cluny Abbey in Burgundy had a kitchen capable of preparing meals for 500 monks at once, staffed by cooks, bakers, and assistants whose culinary expertise was often passed down like sacred scripture. And yet, all of this took place behind walls thick with prayer, silence, and incensed to outsiders. Monks were figures of otherworldly discipline. To insiders, the silence at the refectory table was not necessarily a sign of spiritual reflection. It was a way to focus on chewing without interruption. And should a younger brother ever cast a disapproving glance at the abbot's third slice of almond stuffed goose, well, there were always extra chores to assign. Some monks became gourmet theologians, drafting meticulous arguments for how luxury could align with divine will. God made creation abundant. One 15th century monk wrote, so to waste his bounty through asceticism would itself be a sin. A clever twist of logic, seasoned with saffron and simmered in hypocrisy at its peak. Monastic gluttony became so notorious that satire flourished. In folk tales and tavern songs, fat monks were often the butt of jokes, quite literally. One popular rhyme from England mocked the way holy men dined on fish and ale, their bellies round like altar grail. These ballads poked fun not at religion itself, but at the absurd gap between what the monks preached and what they piled on their plates. And yet, to be fair, not all monastics gave in to the gravy boat of temptation. Some truly did live austere, bitter lives of fasting and labor. But it's telling that when noblemen sought comfort, they often retired to monasteries, knowing full well that salvation, in such places, could be pursued one spoonful at a time. That in the end, the gluttony of God's chosen wasn't just a culinary contradiction. It was a window into a broader truth of the medieval world, that even in its most sacred institutions, indulgence found a pew. In the medieval world, no sin was too great to be forgiven, provided your coin purse was heavy enough. And when it came to gluttony, the church not only punished the guilty, it found clever ways to profit from them. By the 12th century, the sale of indulgences had become a divine fast food drive-through for the soul. Commit a sin? Pay a fee. Want to get grandma out of purgatory? Toss a few silver pennies in the coffer. Ate meat on a Friday? That'll cost you. Food sins were especially ripe for monetization. Gluttony wasn't just one of the 7 deadly sins. It was tempting, tangible, and everywhere. And what better way to fund a cathedral than by charging people for the ham they ate on the wrong day? The church developed an elaborate moral economy around eating. Rich noblemen who broke fast during Lent could, for a fee, receive a dispensation. Some bishops even kept a sliding scale of sins and their prices. Roast pig on a feast day? A few florins. Sausage during Holy Week? That's going to cost more. Butter in place of oil during fasting? Believe it or not, butter dispensations were real and popular, especially in Northern Europe. The logic was airtight. If your soul could be cleansed with money, then your meal just needed a receipt. And then came the rise of the food pardon merchants. These traveling sellers hawked indulgences like medieval food trucks of salvation, going from town to town preaching forgiveness in exchange for coins. The irony? They often set up shop right outside taverns and market squares, where the guilt was freshest and the sins still digesting. Meanwhile, monks and priests reminded their congregations that fasting wasn't just a spiritual duty, it was a battlefield of the flesh. Sermons warned against the demon of the belly, claiming Satan lured the faithful with smells of roasting meat and freshly baked bread. But of course, if you fell into temptation, the church stood ready with forgiveness at market rates. The commercialization of guilt didn't stop at meat. There were taxes on salt, tithes on grain, and levies on imported delicacies. Some monasteries grew rich simply by controlling local fasting schedules and selling the necessary exceptions. Imagine, a monk decrees a local famine of sin, then opens a concession stand next door. Even kings got involved. In France, The crown supported the selling of indulgences in exchange for political loyalty. And when monarchs needed cash for wars or castles, they occasionally borrowed church coffers. Coffers filled with money paid by peasants who once dared to eat lamb on Good Friday. It became a strange feedback loop. The faithful sinned, paid for forgiveness, and kept sinning. A cynical person might suggest that the church had no real interest in curbing gluttony. After all, it was too profitable. And if you think this sounds exaggerated, consider the indulgence letters still preserved today. Many are filled with colorful justifications like, Brother Arnulf is hereby pardoned for excessive consumption of capon and ale on the feast of St. Hildegard, in exchange for 5 solidi and a pledge to build a new altar cloth. Even in death, the food sins lingered. Wealthy families paid for post-mortem indulgences on behalf of deceased loved ones, hoping to reduce their time in purgatory. The logic was clear. If Uncle Roland had eaten too many pies and offended God, it could be undone with a few gold coins and a fancy mass.in essence. The church found a way to monetize morality, to sell salvation by the bite. Every forbidden feast became a revenue stream. Every pang of guilt, a business opportunity. It was the ultimate medieval hustle. But perhaps the most farcical example of this entire system was the Butter Tower. Yes, that's a real thing. In Rouen, France, the local cathedral had a problem. It needed money. The clergy, ever so clever, offered the townspeople an indulgence that allowed them to eat butter during Lent. For a price, of course. The result? Enough people bought their way out of olive oil fasting that the proceeds literally funded the construction of an entire cathedral tower, thus earning it the nickname Tour de Beurre, or Butter Tower, a monument to cholesterol and divine loopholes. Elsewhere, in Europe, the church doubled down on this model. Certain dioceses issued seasonal indulgence menus. These pamphlets, yes, actual pamphlets, listed out the going rate for your average sins. Eat poultry on a fasting day, 1 shilling. Eat beef, 2. Rich noblemen gorging on peacock and candied figs. Better start writing checks. The church's grip on this economy of guilt stretched far beyond Europe's urban centers. In rural areas, wandering pardoners traveled from village to village, promising peasant farmers that even their gruel could be sinful if consumed with greed in their hearts. These sermons often ended with the dramatic flourish of a coin box and a guilt-stricken farmer reaching for his last copper coin. The irony? Much of the church's own hierarchy, abbots, bishops, even cardinals, dined like kings. Their banquets were legends of gluttony, 8-course meals, imported wines, roasted game, and elaborate desserts crafted by monastery-trained chefs, all while preaching to the masses about the virtues of restraint and the perils of overindulgence. It created a strange two-tier morality. The rich sinned with style, the poor sinned with soup, and both paid the church to feel better about it. And don't be fooled into thinking these were one-off events. In 14th century England, Lenten dispensations were so common that they required full-time clerks just to process the paperwork. The papal curia in Avignon kept detailed ledgers of who had bought indulgences, how much was paid, and for which culinary crimes. In some cases, bishops even pre-approved future gluttony in exchange for donations, a sort of heavenly credit system. Eat now, repent later. By the late Middle Ages, the system had become so absurd that some theologians began speaking out. Preachers like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus decried the church's gluttony economy, warning that true repentance couldn't be bought like sausages at market. But of course, they were ignored, or worse, excommunicated, and then came the tipping point. Was food. Yes, food. That helped set off the Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg in 1517, one of his central complaints was the sale of indulgences, including those for eating sins. The idea that the soul's salvation could be bought and sold enraged him. And he wasn't alone. Across Europe, the people had begun to question, if God truly cared what I had for dinner, why did he need my coin afterward? So yes, in a way, meat on Fridays helped split the church that it's almost poetic. In the medieval imagination, sin had a smell, and so did sickness. And the line between the two was disturbingly blurry. Long before bacteria or viruses entered the picture, people in Europe believed that disease floated invisibly through the air in the form of miasma, noxious, putrid odors that emanated from human waste, rotting food, stagnant water, and worst of all, other people. If it stank, it was probably sinful. And if you were sick, it was likely because you'd breathed in someone else's corruption. This belief system, the miasma theory, wasn't just popular folklore. It was mainstream medicine, taught in universities, preached by priests, enforced by law, and it didn't just affect how people understood illness. It transformed how they built cities, treated the poor, designed clothing, and even chose when to breathe. Take, for example, the design of medieval cities. Winding, narrow alleyways filled with trash and sewage weren't just inconvenient, they were death traps. The closer you lived to the street gutters or to public cesspits, the higher your risk of being engulfed in deadly vapors. That's why the wealthy paid for homes with higher floors, believing that elevation alone might save them from the smell of sin. It also explains the rise of what we might call medieval PP, gloves, herbs, and the ubiquitous perfumed handkerchief. Aristocrats, especially women, carried delicate cloths laced with lavender, rose oil, or camphor to press over their noses in crowded markets or while walking near poor neighborhoods. A single whiff of bad air could supposedly corrupt the soul and the body. But of course, this system had deep social implications. Because if smell equaled sickness and sickness equaled sin, then the poor, who lived among foul air daily, were seen not just as unlucky, but as morally diseased. Their neighborhoods were labeled as plague zones. Their bodies were assumed to be vessels of infection, and their suffering was often viewed as punishment from God. This paranoia reached new heights during times of crisis, like the Black Death. As plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, miasma theory fueled waves of hysteria. Entire neighborhoods were burned or abandoned not because people were sick, but because they smelled wrong. Cities ordered the slaughter of stray dogs and cats, blaming their stink for the spread. And perfumers became as important as physicians. Some places, priests even offered special clean air blessings, waving incense over homes and alleys while reciting Latin to banish evil smells. It wasn't uncommon for dying patients to be surrounded by bowls of vinegar, herbs, and sometimes even burning tar, meant to purify the atmosphere. If that sounds like overkill, just remember, this was medicine. Of course, not everyone had access to perfumed cloths or incense rituals. The poor made do with their own superstitions. Some carried rotten apples in their pockets, believing that a stronger smell could overpower a deadly one. Others smeared animal fat on their nostrils to block the air. One chronicler even recorded a man who wore a dead mouse in a pouch, thinking its stink would protect him from worse evils. Even architecture responded to the fear. Hospitals and almshouses were often built with large windows and open courtyards, not for sunlight or beauty, but to let evil vapors escape. And toilets, when they existed, were built far from sleeping quarters, sometimes even suspended over rivers to carry the smell away. But here's the kicker. Miasma theory persisted for centuries, long after its flaws were exposed. Even as microscopes revealed tiny organisms, many still clung to the idea that air held moral danger. The smell of rot wasn't just disgusting. It was seen as a warning, a sign that the world was out of balance, that sin had seeped into the soil and the very air we breathed. That it wasn't until the late 19th century that germ theory fully replaced miasma in the minds of doctors. But by then, the fear of foulness had left a permanent mark on European society. In architecture, medicine, religion, and the ever-growing obsession with freshness, perfume, and cleanliness equals godliness. The irony: many of those who avoided bad smells still died of disease anyway. Because while they held scented cloths to their faces, the real killers, bacteria, slipped silently past us. Own next time you light a lavender candle or plug in an air freshener. Just remember, you're participating in a ritual that once involved holy smoke, sin-sniffing priests, and the wholesale slaughter of street cats. Sweet dreams. As the centuries passed, the obsession with air quality didn't fade. It evolved. During the Renaissance, even as science advanced, the link between morality and smell only deepened. Cities like Florence and Paris began passing more detailed sanitation laws, not out of compassion for the poor, but to combat the stench. Paris even created one of the first municipal street cleaning teams, who worked at dawn to sweep away horse manure, rotting vegetables, and God knows what else. But it wasn't public health that motivated them. It was the rising complaints of noble noses. Wealthier households began investing in luxury air control, not with filters or vents, but with potpourri cabinets, herb-stuffed wall hangings, and perfume fountains. Some aristocrats even kept odor wards, servants whose job was to burn incense, wave fans, or spritz rose water through the air to keep the room pure. And if you think this was just about comfort, think again. In many manuals of courtly behavior, the ideal nobleman wasn't just clean, he smelled righteous. A whiff of sweat or rot could be seen as a sign of gluttony, lust, or sloth. People began judging others not only by their clothes or speech, but by the odor of their soul. If you smelled like rosemary and sandalwood, you were close to God. If you reeked of onions and damp wool, well, maybe the devil had claimed your gut. This spiritualized olfactory panic reached some truly absurd heights. One bishop in 16th century Spain reportedly banned garlic from all church grounds, claiming that its smell distracted angels. In England, some hospitals gave patients perfumed wafers to chew, not for digestion, but to sweeten their breath for any visiting clergy. And in parts of Germany, nuns were forbidden from visiting the sick without lavender bags, lest they absorb the miasma of unconfessed sins. But none of this was a joke to those living it. Smell could dictate who got hired, who got married, even who got buried. Some wills even included money for perfuming the corpse, so the deceased wouldn't carry their sins into the next life with a stink. And then came the Age of Enlightenment, which, ironically, only made things weirder as doctors began experimenting. With anatomy and early pathology, they made the terrifying discovery that rotting corpses released gases, foul, thick, and unmistakable. To the scientific mind of the 1700s, this seemed like proof that death released poison into the air. Graveyards were moved out of cities. Autopsies were performed with scented cloths tied around the face. And medical schools began insisting on airflow and fragrance, but not everyone had access to a clean, perfumed world. For most commoners, daily life still reeked. In fact, the 18th and early 19th centuries may have been among the smelliest eras in European history. Public toilets overflowed. Slaughterhouses operated in open streets. Tanneries dumped blood and skin into nearby rivers. And under every tenement, an alley ran a river of raw, bubbling waste. Still, people clung to their belief that if you couldn't smell it, it couldn't hurt you. And so, while diseases like cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis spread like wildfire, the focus remained on masking the smell, not removing the source. This gave rise to what historians now call the Privy Panic of the Victorian era cities. Industrialized, urban populations exploded, and so did the sewage. Suddenly, the elites couldn't escape the stink. Even their walled gardens and marble parlors weren't immune. It wasn't just the poor who were offensive now, it was everyone. And thus began a frantic arms race in odor control, deodorizing powder, perfumed soaps, daily undergarment changes. Some cities, like London, poured lime into cesspools to neutralize the moral rot. Engineers built enormous sewer systems not just to clean the streets, but to save the souls of the people breathing them. Even architecture became obsessed with air purification. The placement of windows, balconies, and ventilation shafts all stemmed from the lingering miasma fears. The sick room became a staple of Victorian homes, a place to isolate the unwell, always with a bowl of vinegar and a cracked window nearby. And what of public morality? Well, if you were poor and sick, you still stank. And if you stank, you were still judged. What began as a fear of bad smells turned into centuries of architectural changes, class discrimination, strange rituals, perfumed hypocrisy, and a bizarre marriage between medicine and morality. Even today, echoes of the miasma theory survive. Think about the way we equate freshness with virtue, the billions we spend on fragrances, the subtle shame we place on body odor, even when it's natural. The panic over dirty air that we may not believe sin floats on the breeze anymore, but we still act like it might. Let's be honest, when you set out to eat less, to conquer the flesh, to mortify the gluttonous soul, you probably don't expect to end up inventing some of the most lavish loopholes in food history. And yet, the medieval church, in its effort to suppress sin at the dinner table, somehow became the most creative kitchen in Europe. Welcome to the monastic menu makeover, where monks vowed to fast for the salvation of all mankind, and then promptly asked, "Does swan count as fish?" We begin in the 12th century, when monastic orders were flourishing across Europe. Monks in Benedictine and Cistercian communities swore lives of discipline. No meat, no extravagance, just prayer, silence, and porridge. Lots of porridge, but here's the thing. As monasteries became wealthier, their kitchens began to reflect that wealth. Noble families donated land, vineyards, fishing rights, and sometimes full herds of livestock. So now you had men sworn to asceticism with access to better ingredients than most kings to eso what to do. Invent the gray zones. Monks developed elaborate theological justifications to eat more while technically sinning less. The most famous was the idea that fish is not meat. This wasn't just about trout and cod. It soon included dolphins, porpoises, seals, and even barnacle geese, which were rumored to grow from driftwood and therefore clearly not animals of the earth. One 13th century French abbot is said to have served beaver tail on Fridays, arguing it was more akin to a fin than a flank. And let's not even get started on otter stew, which made the rounds in Flemish abbeys during Lent. But the real showstopper, the development of multi-course, fasting feasts. Picture this, a Lenten banquet in a wealthy English priory. Starters, salted herring and almond paste tarts. Mains, eel pie, followed by a roasted swan glazed in saffron honey, reclassified as aquatic fowl. Dessert, Pear compote with clove, syrup, and candied violet petals, all washed down with monk-brewed ale. Blessed, of course, to be why the 14th century, some monastic communities had multiple kitchens, including a flesh kitchen for guests and feast days, a fish kitchen for fast days, and even a secret kitchen for the more discreet. Indulgences. One chronicler sarcastically called it the third door to salvation. But perhaps the most shocking part was that the hierarchy knew and encouraged it. Popes and bishops dined lavishly during fasting periods, their chefs crafting meals that walked the razor-thin line between obedience and opulence. The sin wasn't what you ate, it was how you framed it. There were even cookbooks written specifically for fasting seasons. The most famous, Le Ménagier de Paris, circa 1393, includes over 100 linen recipes, many of them packed with spice, sugar, and imported ingredients from as far as North Africa. And here's the best part. The church didn't see this as hypocrisy. They saw it as ingenuity in service of the soul. As long as the rules weren't technically broken, there was no sin. And in this loophole, medieval culinary culture bloomed while peasants gnawed on old barley and dried beans. Monks in cloisters dined on saffron trout with almond milk glaze, congratulating themselves for their virtue. There's even a term for this paradox: gastronomic penance. The idea that suffering didn't have to mean hunger. It just had to be structured, regulated, holy. And what does this tell us about the medieval mind? That guilt was never about the stomach. It was about the performance of restraint, the theater of denial. You didn't have to actually suffer, just show that you understood the rules. Then, with the right incantations and a little fishy semantics, you could gorge yourself on spiritual technicalities. It was, in many ways, the birth of religious branding, the idea that how a thing appears matters more than what it is. Fast, but feast. Abstain, but indulge. Be holy, but make it gourmet. That was the monastic compromise, and it was delicious to just how far did this theological cuisine go? Well, let's take a trip to medieval Florence, where Dominican friars once created what we might call the spiritual tasting menu. During periods of fasting, they invented clever substitutions: almond milk instead of cow's milk, fish blood to imitate animal-based broths, and jellied eels as a replacement for sausage. Austerity? Yes. But make it gourmet. It wasn't just about cheating the system. It was about elevating the loophole into an art form. Wealthy monastic orders didn't just follow the rules. They commissioned chefs and cooks who could twist them into the most edible shape possible. There's evidence that monasteries employed professional fishmongers, imported exotic spices through connections with merchant families, and kept records of seafood prices like stock traders. In one particularly eye-opening chronicle from 1382, a French abbot berated his monks, not for breaking fast, but for serving pike without lemon glaze, calling it a vulgar presentation unworthy of a holy table. Let that sink in. In an age where peasants often ate the same gruel every day, some monks were arguing about presentation and plating. Somewhere between guilt and gastronomy, the fast had become fashion. And just when you think the church couldn't go further into culinary contortions, enter the barnacle goose. This bird, native to the British Isles, was considered perfectly edible during Lent. Why? Because for centuries, Europeans believed it didn't hatch from eggs, but grew from driftwood or grew on trees along the coast. Since they didn't reproduce like other land animals, they weren't really animals at all, more like aquatic plants. Holy salad, anyone. This idea became so widespread that bishops actually defended it in writing. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council finally stepped in and said, "No, barnacle geese are birds. You may not eat them during fasting." But by then, it was too late. The goose was already on the plate, and in the stained glass windows. Monasteries weren't alone in this sacred gluttony. Aristocratic families, particularly those close to the church, emulated the practice. Some even kept Lenten chefs on staff, cooks specifically trained to make fasting look and taste like feasting. If you ever see a medieval painting of a long table filled with figs, shellfish, trout, and rose petal water pitchers, odds are it was painted in Lent. And it wasn't just about indulgence. It was a spiritual display, a balancing act between earthly enjoyment and divine discipline. The richer and more elaborate your fast, the more it showed you understood the weight of sacrifice. Eating well became a kind of holy performance. But here's the kicker: the average person? They didn't get loopholes. They didn't get porpoise pie or saffron trout. Most of them just starved. Or, at best, they survived on black bread and boiled peas while watching the monastery cart in another barrel of Bordeaux for their abstinence dinner. There's something deeply ironic about it all. The monks had, through their devout efforts, created the first prototype of the modern gourmet diet. No meat. No problem. Replace it with almond milk, fried anchovies, fig syrup, honey cakes, and a sprinkle of theological justification that in many ways. These religious food rules gave rise to culinary creativity centuries ahead of their time. The very attempt to suppress gluttony led to food experimentation, spice imports, the documentation of recipes, and even the birth of food-based ritual theater, where dining became sacred drama. By the late 15th century, some monastic kitchens had cookbooks that rivaled royal courts. And while peasants struggled with famine, their spiritual shepherds were sampling caviar from the Danube on a Friday. Was it hypocrisy? Maybe. But it was also medieval logic in action, as long as you could prove that what you were doing wasn't technically wrong. You were free to enjoy it. And really, is that so different from us today? In this part of our strange culinary pilgrimage, we've seen how morality shaped the menu, how faith fed the appetite, and how even the most devout institutions sometimes outate the kings they prayed for. It leaves us with a strange aftertaste. That in the Middle Ages, sin wasn't always what you ate. It was what you called it. So the next time you hear someone say they're being good for cutting out meat, or naughty for adding whipped cream, just remember, they're echoing 1,000 years of edible theology, and they have no idea how tame their cheat day really is. Let's be clear. In the Middle Ages, not eating could be more powerful than eating. Fasting wasn't just a religious duty. It was a statement, a performance, a social currency, and, in many ways, it became a battleground for influence, control, and virtue signaling. Long before Twitter ever existed. Picture this. It's the 13th century. You're attending a royal banquet in Paris. The king sits beneath a golden canopy. Silver goblets clink. Minstrels play soft lyre music in the background. Then, just as the roasted swan is about to be served, the Archbishop of Sens rises and solemnly declares, "I shall abstain for my soul's sake." Suddenly, everyone freezes. Nobles shift awkwardly. The queen whispers to her confessor. One duke gently pushes away his venison with a sad little sigh. No one wants to look less holy than the archbishop. And just like that, a table of meat eaters becomes a table of repentant lentils and embarrassed fruit trays. Welcome to the Holy Hunger Games, where public displays of abstinence meant power. Throughout medieval Europe, fasting became a kind of spiritual pageantry, especially among the elite. Kings, bishops, nobles, even wealthy merchants all knew the value of being seen to suffer for God. The more dramatic your fast, the more people whispered of your piety. Saint Louis IX of France, one of the most revered monarchs of his time, reportedly fasted so severely during Lent that his own advisors begged him to eat. He refused. He was doing it for the kingdom's salvation. In court records, his fasts are described as a shield against the devil and a visible sacrifice for the sins of men. In reality, it made him look like God's favorite king that it wasn't just rulers. Papal elections and church councils were full of elaborate fasts. When cardinals gathered in conclave, the tension wasn't just about votes. It was about who could resist food the longest, who was seen praying rather than chewing. One 12th century account describes how the conclave of Velletri saw several clerics collapse, not from the weight of their consciences, but from literal hunger. And if you're imagining this only happened in churches, think again. Public fasts were often staged in full view of the people, with open-air processions, ash-smeared faces, and sermons railing against the sins of gluttony. The richer the city, the more elaborate the fast. Entire communities would shut down markets, cover statues, and dress in gray, not just for penance, but for optics. But fasting wasn't always self-punishment. Sometimes it was a political weapon. Consider the anchorites, those holy men and women who voluntarily enclosed themselves in tiny cells for life, refusing rich food and human contact. Their extreme fasting made them folk heroes, celebrities even. Some gained so much public influence, their opinions could sway kings and bishops. Saint Catherine of Siena reportedly lived for years on nothing but the Eucharist. Her refusal to eat was so famous, it became a national obsession. People believed she could survive purely on divine energy. More importantly, they listened to her. When she told Pope Gregory XI to return the papacy from Avignon to Rome, he did. Think about that. A woman who hadn't eaten meat in decades told the Pope where to live, and he obeyed. In some regions, fasting became a way to shame corrupt officials. The people of Florence would stage mass fasts when angry at the city's government. The message? We are purifying ourselves while you feast on sin. It was medieval hunger striking. Only with incense. Of course, it wasn't enough just to fast. You had to fast better than your rivals. Convents and monasteries competed for spiritual prestige. If the Dominicans fasted for 60 days, the Franciscans went for 70. If the Cistercians banned meat, the Carthusians banned dairy and meat and idle conversation. There were public rankings of holiness. Chronicles noted who ate what and when. Some abbeys even kept records like Brother Thaddeus consumed only rainwater and moss for 3 Lent straight. He achieved 9.5 holy points. Abbot Reginald wept while drinking thin broth. Documented by 3 witnesses. Bonus for tears. Okay, the point system is fictional, but the mindset wasn't. In the age before Yelp reviews or Instagram stories, your reputation as a fasting icon was built on public memory, chronicled by scribes and whispered by pilgrims. A good fast could get you canonized. A weak one, forgotten, or worse, accused of spiritual laziness. And yet, humans are humans. Not everyone who fasted in public actually abstained in private. There are countless records of monks sneaking meat behind monastery doors, of nobles throwing secret feasts during Lent, and of friars bribing cooks for silent meals. One abbey in Burgundy reportedly built an underground dining room where abbots could indulge away from peasant eyes. A letter from 1477 laments. The bishop proclaims ashes in the square, then feasts on salted pork by the candlelight of his own hypocrisy. Some lords even hired fasting proxies, poor villagers who would publicly fast and pray on their behalf in exchange for bread and coins. Imagine sending someone else to suffer while you butter your eel pie. Now that's delegation. Fasting was never just about food. It was about identity, power, and performance. For the poor, it was forced. For the rich, it was curated. For the devout, it was a ladder to heaven. And for the clever, it was a branding strategy that it's easy to laugh at it now. But are we really so different? We don't wear sackcloth and ashes, but we hashtag clean eating and count calories on apps. We post our smoothies, our no sugar weeks, our guilt-free oat milk froth. And yes, we judge others who don't. In a way, medieval fasting wasn't primitive. It was the first influencer diet. As the centuries rolled forward, fasting grew. Arms, legs, and political teeth. It no longer just belonged to monasteries or the penitent faithful. Entire kingdoms fasted, not because of hunger, but to show moral superiority, spiritual alignment, or, quite honestly, to keep up appearances. During times of war or plague, monarchs would declare national fasts. In England during the Hundred Years' War, a royal decree instructed all Christians to abstain from meat and wine every Wednesday, so that God might bless the realm with victory. That's right. God's favor could allegedly be bought not with gold, but with peas and salted fish. These public acts were often followed by processions through the city. Imagine a parade of miserable faces. Children in burlap tunics, clergy chanting psalms, women dressed in mourning colors, while butchers quietly sulked in their closed stalls, counting lost profits. That let's not pretend people had a choice. While fasting was framed as voluntary penance, in many cases it became socially coercive or outright mandatory. In 14th century Florence, if you were caught roasting meat during Lent, the city could fine you, confiscate your property, or worse, accuse you of heresy. Several cities even appointed fasting inspectors, whose job it was to sniff for sizzling fat in alleys and listen for the telltale hiss of illicit butter in pans. Yes, medieval Karen was armed with incense and ecclesiastical authority. In rural villages, it was often the priests who policed behavior. Parishioners who violated fast days could be forced to confess publicly or endure humiliating penance, such as wearing a pig's tail tied to their belt for a week. One French sermon from the 1200s thundered, "He who eats meat in Lent shall chew in hell, and his tongue shall roast upon the devil's griddle." Effective marketing, wouldn't you say? Rulers used fasts to send messages, not just to God, but to other kings. When the Byzantine Emperor Andronikos II wanted to mend relations with the Pope, he declared a 40-day fast throughout Constantinople. The symbolism? Look how penitent and holy our people are. We are worthy of communion. In effect, fasting became a kind of spiritual diplomacy. In Spain, Queen Isabella I, yes, that Isabella, was infamous for her strict public fasts, especially during military campaigns. Her soldiers were required to abstain from meat before battle, and she often refused rich meals while camped. Chronicles describe her as wielding the sword in one hand and the crucifix in the other, fasting for every soul she sent to God. Whether that was literal or not is up for debate, but her reputation for holiness helped consolidate power over both nobles. In clergy, fasting fever wasn't just a Western Catholic thing. Eastern Orthodox Christians were arguably even stricter. The Byzantine Church prescribed over 200 days of fasting per year, with not just meat but dairy, oil, and wine forbidden. During Great Lent, some monks lived on nothing but raw greens and vinegar-soaked bread. In Ethiopia, where Christianity thrived since the 4th century, royal courts often competed with monastic leaders in displays of abstinence. Fasting there wasn't just religious, it became a metric of legitimacy. The more the emperor fasted, the more divine his rule was seen. And during the Christianization of Eastern Europe, Missionaries often brought fasting practices before they brought full theology. The idea being, if they'll give up sausage for God, they're halfway to salvation. Now here's the punchline. The poor couldn't really fast, not because they didn't want to, but because there was nothing to abstain from. Their diet already consisted of water, black bread, onions, and maybe a turnip if it was a lucky week. On fast days, they were expected to eat even less. Imagine being told to do without butter when you couldn't afford butter to begin with. But fasting rules didn't always account for that. The church, in its attempts to regulate holiness, often treated fasting as an equal obligation for unequal people. And those who failed, well, they were labeled as weak, sinful, or disobedient. Some towns gave out tokens to the poor to help them buy acceptable fast day foods. Others simply sent them to the local monastery for soup, if there was any. This discrepancy became glaring in plague times. As disease swept through Europe, the rich could retreat to estates and fast in comfort, while the poor died hungry on the streets, still technically obeying the rules of Lent that I ensured. Medieval fasting was never just about giving up meat. It was a ritual of power, a game of appearances, and a moral theater. From royal courts to mud huts, it crept into every corner of life, insisting that salvation required an empty plate and a full heart. Did everyone buy it? Of course not, but enough people did. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Because in a world of uncertainty, where plague and war and hellfire loomed large, fasting gave people a sense of control, a way to tip the scales of fate, a way to show God and their neighbors that they were trying, even if, after sundown, they snuck a bite of eel pie in the dark. In a world where food was sacred and sin was served with every bite, the most pious act of devotion wasn't kneeling for hours in prayer or walking barefoot on pilgrimage. It was fasting to the point of physical collapse. Welcome to the haunting phenomenon of holy anorexia. Yes, long before modern eating disorders had clinical names, medieval saints, especially women, were praised for their radical refusal of food. They didn't merely abstain from meat or dairy on Lent. They refused nourishment altogether, believing that starving the body purified the soul and drew them closer to God. Take St. Catherine of Siena, one of the most well-known holy fasters of the 14th century. Born into a large family of cloth dyers, Catherine began fasting in childhood. By her late teens, she had virtually stopped eating anything except the Eucharist, literally surviving on a daily communion wafer and a few sips of water. To Catherine, this wasn't suffering. This was union with Christ. She described the Eucharist as the only nourishment she required, and when pressed by worried family or confessors, she insisted that physical food made her ill. Only divine love sustained her. Her confessor once noted that she recoiled in pain even from vegetables. Her body withered, but her fame grew. Catherine became a spiritual advisor to popes, a political negotiator, and eventually a saint canonized by the Church. Her extreme fasting wasn't seen as illness, but as holiness. Catherine was far from alone. Saint Angela of Foligno, Saint Ludwina of Schiedam, and Blessed Lucy of Narni all practiced radical food refusal. Some lived for years on little more than water or bitter herbs. Others vomited after eating, flagellated themselves, or slept on beds of thorns. These women often reported visions, mystical experiences, and an overwhelming love of Christ. Their self-starvation was seen as martyrdom without the flames, a private crucifixion of the flesh. And here's the striking part. Their fame spread precisely because of their emaciation. Artists painted them gaunt, eyes uplifted in ecstasy, with bony fingers clutching rosaries or pressing against their sunken chests. To the medieval viewer, these were not images of suffering, but of spiritual triumph in a society where women had little control over their bodies or choices. Holy anorexia became a strange form of resistance and agency. Girls like Catherine defied arranged marriages, refused family meals, and withdrew from worldly expectations by fasting to extremes. They carved out religious authority through their suffering, becoming spiritual leaders, mystics, and even political influencers. Their refusal of food was, paradoxically, a form of power. Some scholars argue that fasting was the only acceptable rebellion for medieval women, a way to say no without being burned as a heretic. Others note how church officials encouraged these women, carefully managing their public image while quietly marveling at their spiritual endurance. There were, of course, darker moments. Some saints' bodies wasted away so completely they could barely walk or speak. Others died young, their deaths recorded not as medical tragedies, but as triumphant ascents to heaven. Saint Columba of Rieti reportedly levitated while praying, on an empty stomach. Blessed Christina the Astonishing survived on nothing but her own breast milk for weeks, and many were said to emit sweet odors as their bodies decayed, a sign of sainthood. Yet behind these miracles lay pain, tooth loss, fainting, hallucinations, and death that if such behavior happened today, it would be treated with hospitalization and therapy. But in the medieval world, these women were canonized. The institutional church both admired and feared these saints. Their influence was undeniable, but their actions were difficult to control. A woman who refused food might also refuse bishops. She might challenge authority, claim visions, or disrupt local politics. Thus, many female fasters were only canonized posthumously, after their deaths made them safer. Their suffering could then be interpreted through the comforting lens of sainthood, rather than the chaos of living resistance. Even so, some church leaders cautioned against imitation, warning that such extreme mortification was not for everyone. Manuals for confessors began including questions like, is she truly pious or possessed by pride? But by then, the cult of holy anorexia had already left its mark. So here we are, face to face with a paradox. In a society where eating could be a sin, not eating at all became the ultimate virtue. The holiest women were those who wasted away while glowing with divine ecstasy. Their legacy still echoes today, in art, in literature, even in modern perceptions of sanctity and suffering. That it's unsettling, it's tragic, and yes, it's deeply human, because in the end, these women weren't saints because they starved. They were saints because they believed that in emptying their bodies, they could fill their souls. And for the medieval mind, that was a miracle worth dying for. Imagine a world where eating could damn your soul, yet not eating could kill you. A civilization that prayed with bread and wine, yet feared gluttony more than hunger. Welcome to the final paradox of the medieval table, a place where sin and salvation were served from the same dish. From fasting monks gorging in secret, to peasants forced into holy abstinence by starvation, to queens who publicly wept at banquets for fear of appearing indulgent, the medieval relationship with food was a battlefield of contradictions, guilt, and divine yearning. Food, in theory, was a gift from God. Bread was sacred. The act of breaking it was central to Christian worship. Give us this day our daily bread wasn't just a prayer, it was survival. But just beneath the crust of every loaf lay a profound suspicion that the pleasure of eating was dangerous. The church preached that the body was weak, the appetites unruly, and that to enjoy too much of anything was to fall prey to the 7 deadly sins. At the top of this slippery slope, gluttony, not greed, not wrath. Gluttony.to eat too well, too often, too eagerly, was to court damnation. Yet, even as saints wasted away, bishops dined in grandeur. Even as peasants counted their beans during Lent, monasteries were filling their bellies with fish soaked in wine. Medieval feasts were not just meals. They were performances, stages upon which sin and sanctity played out side by side. At royal courts, guests often cried with guilt over indulgence, only to return for second helpings. Lavish dishes were sculpted into religious symbols: roasted swans with wings lifted like angels, fish molded into crosses. Every plate carried both devotion and temptation. In one 13th century banquet, monks reportedly sang hymns as they butchered 400 roasted chickens. In another, a bishop excused his third course of veal with the words, "For the glory of God's creation." The very act of feasting became a holy gamble. Eat in moderation and give thanks, and you're virtuous. But take one bite too many, and you've committed sin. The line between feast and fall was razor thin. Let us not forget those for whom fasting was not a choice. For peasants, holy abstinence was often a euphemism for hunger. During Lent, church law forbade meat, but most villagers couldn't afford it anyway. On fast days, they boiled weeds and prayed for rain. Monks could opt to eat eel pie and feel virtuous. Peasants ate barley porridge and hoped not to die. This is the cruel irony of the era. The wealthy fasted as a display of piety, while the poor fasted as a matter of survival, and were still told to do more. Despite all the contradictions, the medieval obsession with food wasn't just about control. It was about meaning. To them, eating was not neutral, it was deeply moral. Every mouthful was a decision, a statement, a prayer. Modern eyes may see this as madness, but for them, it was structure and chaos. In a world of disease, famine, war, and uncertainty, at least you could regulate the contents of your own bowl. And perhaps, by doing so, you could shape your soul that it's a testament to the power of belief. And a reminder that for all our progress, we too remain haunted by the food we eat, the guilt, the rituals, the rules. Perhaps the medieval mind is not so far from ours after all. In the Middle Ages, a woman's appetite was more than just a private matter. It was a reflection of her soul. The church taught that Eve's first sin was one of appetite. She ate what she should not. From that moment forward, eating, especially in women, was tinged with suspicion. To eat too eagerly was to show weakness. To eat too richly, vanity. To eat it all without permission, defiance. Women of the nobility were often praised for their fasting, and those who dined in public were expected to do so delicately, modestly, almost apologetically. There were even treatises on how noble women should eat. Small bites, lips closed, no chewing sounds, no second servings. And yet, those same women might return home to secret indulgences, perhaps even prescribed by priests who worried about their health. One documented case from 14th century France describes a noblewoman who was reprimanded for publicly refusing a meal, only to privately consume an entire roast bird as penance for tempting her hosts into pride. Fasting became a currency of chastity. Some girls were encouraged to fast to curb impure thoughts. The thinner the body, it was said, the more room for the Holy Spirit. It was holy anorexia, born not just from faith, but from pressure, patriarchy, and purity culture. It be why the late 14th and 15th centuries, Europe saw a rise in radical lay mystics, many of them women, who engaged in self-starvation as a pathway to God. Some refused all food except the Eucharist. Others vomited meals after eating, believing their bodies unworthy to digest earthly sustenance. Catherine of Genoa claimed that eating felt like chewing sin. Marjorie Kemp, a mystic famous for her ecstatic weeping, fasted for weeks to cleanse herself of carnal thoughts. These acts were praised by some and feared by others. Local clergy struggled with how to categorize such behavior. Was it holiness or heresy? One cleric in 1431 wrote that the devil wears the robes of restraint, a warning that not all fasting was born of divine virtue. In some regions, church officials began monitoring women's fasts more closely. They feared that unchecked, piety was turning into spiritual pride, or worse, a subtle form of rebellion. For all its contradictions, food in the medieval world remained one of the few ways individuals, especially women and the poor, could express agency. They could not own land, or vote, or speak freely, but they could refuse the next bite. They could fast in defiance, eat in protest, or perform piety through hunger. And because food touched every class, every religion, every village and castle alike, it became the quietest form of power and the most universal expression of belief. In this way, the spoon became both a weapon and a rosary. Now, centuries later, as we navigate fad diets, detoxes, moral panic over calories, and virtue signaling through organic food, can we really say we've moved on? We no longer call it gluttony, but overeating. We don't confess it to a priest, but to a fitness tracker. We don't starve for salvation, but for social media approval. The medieval table may be gone, but its legacy lingers on every supermarket shelf.